Hello, Night Seekers, and welcome to Lacuna Noir. This is where forgotten stories and gentle voices meet, carrying you softly into peaceful sleep, wrapped in mystery. Before tonight's stories begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And a little note before we begin. You may notice a few brief ads in the first 10 minutes, but after that, the rest of the video is completely ad-free. Just you, the silence, and the stories. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the night carry you. If you're drawn to these quiet, shadowed nights, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story when darkness calls. A few years ago, I had to undergo a minor surgery that required anesthesia and a short recovery period afterward. It wasn't anything life-threatening, but it was still serious enough that my doctor told me I should not drive myself home and should spend the night somewhere comfortable, where someone could keep an eye on me. My wife and I decided it would be easiest to stay at my parents' house for the night. They lived fairly close to the hospital, and their house had more space for us to rest than our apartment did at the time. By the time we arrived there, I was exhausted. Surgery, even when it's routine, has a way of draining all your energy. The medication made my head feel foggy, and I had a low fever that made everything feel a little surreal. I remember barely making it through the door before wanting to lie down. My parents set up an air mattress for me in the living room so I could sleep somewhere comfortable without needing to climb stairs. My wife stayed nearby on the couch beside the mattress so she could keep an eye on me if I needed anything during the night. The living room in my parents' house has a large set of picture windows that face the front yard. During the day, they let in a lot of sunlight, but at night, they look out onto darkness, with only faint light from the moon or distant streetlights. By the time we settled down, it was already late. I remember lying on the air mattress, feeling half awake and half asleep at the same time. The medication from the hospital and the fever made my body feel heavy, like I was drifting in and out of sleep without fully realizing it. My wife told me later that I fell asleep fairly quickly. She stayed awake a little longer on the couch, occasionally glancing over to make sure I was resting comfortably. The house was quiet. My parents had already gone to bed, and there was no noise except the faint ticking of the wall clock and the occasional creak that houses make at night. At some point during the early morning hours, before sunrise, something woke her up. She said the first thing she noticed was the sound of birds outside. Not the usual quiet chirping you sometimes hear before dawn, but louder squawking sounds that seemed agitated. It was unusual enough that it pulled her out of sleep. When she opened her eyes, the living room was still dim and shadowy. The sky outside the windows had just begun to lighten slightly, but the sun hadn't risen yet. The yard was still mostly dark. That's when she saw something she could never fully explain. She said a dark shape appeared near the large windows. At first, she thought it might be some strange shadow or maybe even a bird flying past the glass. But as she continued watching, she realized it was something much larger and much closer than that. The shape moved through the window, not as if it broke the glass or opened anything, but as if it simply passed through. She described it as a dark figure, almost like a shadow, drifting slowly into the living room. At first, she was too shocked to move. The shape hovered slightly above the floor as it moved through the room. Then it began to move down the hallway that leads toward my parents' bedroom. She said the movement was slow and deliberate, almost like it was floating rather than walking. Here, for a moment, she wondered if she was still dreaming. The house was silent except for those distant bird sounds outside. The figure drifted down the hallway and disappeared briefly from her view. Then, after several seconds, it began to move back toward the living room again. That was when she started to notice more details. The shape looked like it was wearing some kind of cloak or long robe. The outline wasn't perfectly clear in the dim light, but the shape of the fabric seemed to move as the figure glided through the air. The most unsettling part, she later said, was the face. There wasn't one. Where the face should have been, there was only darkness. No eyes, no mouth, just a hollow shadow beneath the hood of the cloak. As the figure returned to the living room, it drifted slowly toward where I was sleeping on the air mattress. My wife said she felt completely frozen, like her body refused to move even though her mind was screaming at her to react. The figure hovered above me for a moment. She watched it carefully, trying to understand what she was seeing. Then the figure slowly turned toward her. As it did, she noticed its hands. They were thin and bony, like skeletal fingers stretching out from the sleeves of the cloak. One of those hands began reaching in her direction. At that moment, she felt a wave of fear, unlike anything she had experienced before. She said the entire room felt colder suddenly, as if the air temperature had dropped in an instant. Unable to do anything else, she closed her eyes tightly. She said she felt a cold sensation around her neck, like a brief touch of icy air brushing across her skin. Then everything went quiet. After a few seconds, she opened her eyes again. The living room was empty. There was no figure, no movement, no sound except the faint early morning noises outside. I was still asleep on the air mattress, unaware that anything unusual had happened. She stayed awake for the rest of the morning after that. The experience had shaken her badly, and she kept replaying the moment in her mind, trying to understand whether she had actually seen something, or if it had been some kind of dream or hallucination caused by being half asleep. When I woke up later that morning, she told me the entire story. I could tell immediately that she wasn't joking. She looked genuinely unsettled. My wife is not the kind of person who enjoys ghost stories or paranormal discussions. She has always been very practical and skeptical about things like that. But she was clearly disturbed by what she had seen. Later that day, she spent some time researching similar experiences online, trying to see if anyone else had ever described something like it. She eventually found stories from other people who claimed to have seen dark, cloaked figures during moments when they were waking up or falling asleep. Some people described them as shadow figures. Others associated them with sleep paralysis or strange dream states that occur during early morning hours. Even with those possible explanations, the experience still left her uneasy. She insisted that she had been fully awake when she saw the figure. She remembered the details clearly. The floating movement, the cloak, the faceless darkness under the hood, and the bony hand reaching toward her. To this day, we still don't know what she experienced that morning. It might have been a vivid dream caused by exhaustion and the strange environment of sleeping in a different house. It might have been a brief episode of sleep paralysis or a waking hallucination. Or it might have been something else entirely. Whatever the explanation, the memory of that early morning encounter stayed with her long after we left my parents' house. And even though I slept through the entire thing, the story she told me the next day remains one of the strangest experiences connected to that night. One night when I was younger, I experienced something that has stayed in my memory ever since. It was one of those moments where the line between dreams and reality seemed to blur in a way that left me completely shaken. Even now, years later, I still think about it sometimes because of how real everything felt at the time. I was sleeping in my bedroom, which had a loft bed. For anyone who hasn't had one before, A loft bed is basically a raised bed that you climb up into using a ladder. The mattress sits several feet above the floor, almost like a bunk bed without the lower bunk. As a kid, I loved having a loft bed because it made the room feel bigger and gave me a sense of having my own little elevated space. But it also meant that getting in and out of bed involved climbing down a ladder, which could feel a little strange in the dark when you were half asleep. That night, I had gone to bed normally, not thinking about anything unusual. The house was quiet, and everyone else had already gone to sleep. My parents' bedroom was down the hallway from mine, and the rest of the house was dark and silent, the way it always was late at night. At some point during the night, I started having a dream. At the time, though, I had absolutely no idea that I was dreaming. In the dream, I woke up in my loft bed. Everything felt completely real. I was lying there in the darkness of my bedroom, just as I often did when I woke up briefly during the night. The room looked exactly the way it normally did. The faint outline of furniture was visible in the dim light coming from the hallway. Then I heard something, a knocking sound. It seemed to be coming from downstairs somewhere in the house. At first, I thought it might just be a normal noise. Houses sometimes make strange sounds at night. Pipes shifting, wood creaking, or the wind moving something outside. But this knock sounded deliberate, like someone tapping on a door. Then I heard something else. Voices. They were quiet and hushed, almost like people whispering to each other. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound of murmuring voices made the situation feel strange and unsettling. Lying there in the bed, I tried to listen carefully. The voices seemed to be coming from downstairs. My mind began racing with questions. Who would be in the house at that hour? Why would people be whispering downstairs in the middle of the night? Still believing that I was awake, I decided to get out of bed and investigate. Slowly, I climbed down the ladder from my loft bed. Every movement felt real. I could feel the cool air in the room and the slight vibration of the wooden ladder under my hands as I descended. Once I reached the floor, I walked toward my bedroom door. My door was positioned just to the left of the staircase that led downstairs. The door itself was closed, which meant I couldn't see what was happening in the hallway yet. I paused with my hand near the doorknob. That's when I heard something that made my heart begin to race. Footsteps. They were coming up the stairs. The staircase in our house was made of wood, and each step had a distinctive creak when someone walked on it. As I stood there in the dark, I could hear those creaks clearly. Step by step, someone was climbing the stairs. The sound echoed through the hallway. Creak. Pause. Creak. I froze in place near my door, unsure of what to do. In the dream, I remember thinking that someone had broken into the house. The idea seemed terrifying, but I also felt strangely compelled to stay still and listen. The footsteps reached the top of the staircase. Then they moved toward my room. I could hear them approaching slowly. My heart pounded as I stood there, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. Then something strange happened. Instead of opening my door, the footsteps turned away. They moved past my room and continued down the hallway toward my parents' bedroom, which was located just to the right of mine. I listened as the footsteps faded slightly in that direction. Then everything went quiet. The silence felt heavy and unnatural. For several moments, I stood there in the dark, waiting to hear something else. But nothing happened. Eventually, curiosity and fear pushed me to move. I slowly opened my bedroom door and stepped into the hallway. The entire upper floor of the house was completely dark, but everything looked normal. The doors to the other rooms were closed. The hallway was empty. Still believing that this was real life and not a dream, I decided to check the rooms nearby. I walked quietly down the hallway, peeking into each room. Everything appeared exactly as it should. No strangers, no movement, no sign that anyone had been there. After checking the rooms, I began walking back toward my bedroom. I was just about to step inside when I heard something behind me. A faint creak. Then another sound followed it. The best way I can describe it is like a distant cry. It sounded like someone making a noise of deep sadness or despair. The sound was low and eerie, echoing softly through the hallway. Even now, I can still remember how unsettling it felt. For some reason, though, the version of me inside the dream didn't react the way you might expect. Instead of running or investigating further, I simply ignored it. I stepped back into my room and closed the door. Then I climbed back up into my loft bed. Even in the dream, I remember feeling creeped out. But I tried to convince myself that everything was fine. Eventually, I began to relax. The house seemed quiet again. Then suddenly, I heard the cry again. This time, it was louder. And immediately after that came a loud crashing noise. My heart jumped. Then I heard something that terrified me. Footsteps. They were running down the hallway. Fast. Thump, thump, thump. Sound grew louder and louder as whoever, or whatever, it was rushed toward my room. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. Then, bang! My bedroom door burst open. At that exact moment, I woke up. I sat up suddenly in my bed, my heart racing. And to my absolute shock, my bedroom door was actually swinging open. At the same time, my trash can, which had been sitting near the door, had been knocked over and was rolling across the floor. For several seconds, I just sat there staring. My mind struggled to catch up with what had just happened. I had just woken from a dream where someone ran down the hallway and burst into my room. And when I woke up, my door had actually opened in real life. The trash can had fallen over. The room looked exactly like the end of my dream. I stayed frozen in my bed for a while, I trying to calm myself down. Eventually, I convinced myself that there was probably a simple explanation. Most likely, my dog had pushed the door open. He sometimes wandered around the house at night and nudged doors with his nose. If he had pushed the door hard enough, it might have knocked over the trash can. But the timing of it all still felt incredibly strange. The fact that it happened at the exact moment the door burst open in my dream made the whole experience feel far more frightening than it probably was. Even today, I'm fairly sure it was just a coincidence involving my dog. But waking up from a dream about someone running down the hallway toward my room and then seeing my door suddenly crash open in real life was one of the most terrifying moments I experienced as a kid. When I was in the 3rd grade, I used to spend a lot of nights lying awake in bed, long after I was supposed to be asleep. Like many kids, I had a habit of staring at things in my room or out the window and letting my mind wander. My bedroom window faced the side of our yard, and on clear nights I could often see the moon shining brightly through the glass. There was something about the moon that always caught my attention. It felt mysterious and calm at the same time. Sometimes it was big and bright. Sometimes it looked thin and distant. But it always seemed to hang there quietly in the sky, almost like it was watching everything below. One particular night stands out clearly in my memory. I remember lying in bed with the lights off, the room quiet except for the occasional sound of the house settling, or the faint hum of the air conditioner somewhere in the background. The window was uncovered and the moon was shining through brightly enough that I could see its pale light reflecting across parts of the room. Instead of closing my eyes and trying to sleep, I just stared at it. Kids sometimes do strange things when they're bored or unable to fall asleep. That night, I was completely focused on the moon outside the window. I don't even remember what I was thinking about while staring at it. My mind was probably drifting from one random thought to another the way it does when you're half tired and half awake. But I kept watching it. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Eventually, I must have been staring at that moon for nearly half an hour. I remember thinking how perfectly still it looked, hanging there in the sky beyond the glass. The night outside was calm, and nothing seemed to be moving at all. Then something strange happened. The moon moved. At first, it was subtle enough that I wondered if my eyes were playing tricks on me. The movement was slow, almost like it was drifting slightly to one side. I blinked a few times and kept staring. But the movement continued. The bright circle in the sky seemed to slide slowly across the window. For a second or two, it drifted in that slow, steady way that almost made me doubt what I was seeing. Then, suddenly, it accelerated. The light streaked across the sky faster than anything I had ever seen before. Within another second or two, it disappeared completely, almost like it had shot away and warped out of sight. I remember sitting up in bed immediately. My heart was pounding because I couldn't understand what I had just seen. The moon wasn't supposed to move like that. It certainly wasn't supposed to shoot across the sky and vanish in the span of a few seconds. I jumped out of bed and ran to the window to look outside more clearly. The yard was dark and quiet. The sky above was clear, but the moon was gone. For a moment, I thought maybe it had simply moved behind the roofline of the house. So I hurried out of my room and walked through the hallway to the other side of the house where there were more windows facing a different direction. When I looked out at those windows, I saw something that confused me even more. The real moon was visible there. It was sitting calmly in the sky on the other side of the house. In other words, the moon I had been staring at through my bedroom window earlier hadn't been the actual moon at all. That realization made the entire experience feel even stranger. If the real moon had been on the other side of the house the whole time, then what exactly had I been watching for 30 minutes through my window? I remember trying to explain all of this to my parents that night. I was excited and a little scared at the same time, running through the house, telling them about how the moon had moved and then shot away across the sky. But they didn't believe me. To them, it sounded like the kind of story a kid might invent after staying up too late and letting his imagination run wild. They told me it was probably a dream or maybe just a reflection of something moving outside. But I knew what I'd seen, and I remember thinking about it for a long time afterward, wondering what that strange moving light might have been. For years, I occasionally thought back to that night whenever I saw the moon through a window. But that wasn't the only strange thing that happened during my childhood. Another moment came to mind years later when my younger brother and I were playing basketball in our driveway. It was a normal afternoon, the kind where kids spend hours outside shooting hoops and competing with each other over simple games. Our basketball hoop stood near the side of the yard, and the driveway gave us just enough space to dribble, pass, and take shots. We had played there hundreds of times before without anything unusual happening. That day felt completely ordinary at first. My brother and I were running back and forth, he laughing and arguing over whose turn it was to shoot. At one point, I had the ball in my hands and was standing near the edge of the driveway. Just as I was about to make a move, I heard something. A whisper. It sounded like a voice saying a single word. Help. The voice seemed to pass by quickly, almost like someone running past us while speaking. The sound had a strange quality to it, something similar to the Doppler effect you hear when a car drives past quickly. The word stretched slightly as it moved by, fading into the distance almost immediately. The moment I heard it, I froze. The basketball stayed in my hands as I stood there trying to understand what had just happened. My heart began to race a little because the voice had sounded real, very real. I slowly turned my head and looked at my brother. His expression was strange. His eyes were wide, and he looked just as shocked as I felt. For a second, neither of us said anything. Then I asked him the obvious question. "Did you hear that?" I expected him to say yes, but instead, he shook his head. He said he hadn't heard anything. Then he said something that made the moment even more unsettling. He told me that while I was standing there holding the ball, he had seen what looked like a woman run past me. Not walk, run. The strange thing was that I hadn't seen anyone, and he hadn't heard the voice. But somehow I had heard the whisper while he had seen the movement. We both stood there quietly for a moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The driveway was empty. The yard was empty. The street nearby was quiet. There was no sign that anyone had been there at all. Eventually, we tried to shrug it off and continue playing. But the atmosphere had definitely changed. Every small noise suddenly made us glance around nervously. And even though we didn't say it out loud, we both knew that something about that moment had felt deeply unsettling. Even today, when I think back to those childhood memories, those two moments stand out clearly. The night I watched something that looked like the moon drift across my window and then shoot away into the darkness. And the afternoon when I heard a voice whisper for help, while my brother claimed to see someone running past me. Neither of us ever figured out exactly what happened in those moments. But both memories stayed with me long after childhood ended. For most of my life, I have had a complicated relationship with the idea of ghosts or otherworldly things. I wouldn't describe myself as someone who believes every strange story I hear, but I also wouldn't say that I dismiss everything immediately either. I have always tried to keep a balanced mindset about unusual experiences. If something odd happens, I usually look for a normal explanation first. Our minds are capable of playing tricks on us, especially when we are tired, stressed, or in unfamiliar environments. At the same time, I have always had a curiosity about the possibility that there might be things in the world we do not fully understand yet. Growing up, I enjoyed listening to ghost stories and reading about strange encounters people claim to have had. Most of those stories sounded exaggerated or easily explained, but occasionally one would stick in my mind because of how sincere it seemed. Even with that curiosity, I was still someone who tried to stay rational about things. If I heard a strange noise in the house, I would usually assume it was the pipes or the wind. If I saw something odd out of the corner of my eye, I would assume it was just my imagination or a trick of light. That's why the experience I'm about to describe has always stayed with me. It's not because I believe I definitely saw something supernatural, and it's because I cannot easily explain what I saw. At the time this happened, I was living in a fairly new house. My family had moved there not long before, and everything about it still felt fresh and unfamiliar in a good way. The walls were clean, the floors were new, and the house had that quiet atmosphere that comes with recently built homes. I had always felt comfortable there. Nothing about the house ever seemed creepy or unsettling. It wasn't an old building with strange history or strange noises echoing through the walls. It was just a normal house. I was also an only child, which meant I had more space to myself than most kids my age. My parents allowed me to use 2 rooms that were directly across from each other in a narrow hallway at the end of the house. One room served as my bedroom. The other room I used mainly for studying and homework. The hallway itself was fairly narrow, maybe 4 or 5 feet wide. If you stood in the doorway of one room, you could look straight across and see the door of the other room directly opposite. Most of the time, both doors were open when I was moving between them. The setup worked well for me. I liked having a quiet place where I could focus on schoolwork, and when I was done studying, I could simply walk across the hall and relax in my bedroom. On the night this happened, I was sitting in the study room doing homework. My desk faced the wall, and the door to the hallway was slightly to my left. From where I sat, I could see part of the doorway out of the corner of my eye if I turned slightly. The house was quiet that evening. My parents were elsewhere in the house, probably watching television or reading. There was no loud music, no strange noises, nothing that would have made the situation feel unusual. I was simply reading through some material for school. At some point, while I was focused on the pages in front of me, something caught my attention. It was not something I noticed directly at first. It appeared in my peripheral vision. Out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw something in the hallway. At first, I assumed it was just my mind reacting to movement or light. Our peripheral vision is not always reliable, and sometimes shadows shift in ways that make us think we see things that are not actually there. But something about this was different. I slowly turned my eyes slightly toward the doorway. What I saw made my entire body freeze. In the hallway, on the floor just outside the doorway, there appeared to be a figure. It was hunched over in a strange position. The best way I can describe it is that it looked like someone sitting in a fetal position, with their arms wrapped around their bent legs. The figure was completely white. Not pale like a person's skin, but almost bright white. There were no clothes on it that I could see, no clear facial features, no hair. Just a white shape that looked like a human figure curled up on the floor. The moment I registered what I was seeing, a wave of fear hit me so suddenly that I could barely breathe. My entire body went cold. I have heard people describe moments of extreme fear where they become completely frozen in place, and I never fully understood that until it happened to me. In that moment, I couldn't move. My muscles felt locked. Even though part of my brain was telling me to get up and run, my body refused to respond. It felt exactly like those moments in horror movies where the characters stand there unable to move while something terrifying is right in front of them. I always used to wonder why characters in movies didn't just run away immediately. Now I understood. Fear can lock you in place. Time seemed to slow down. I stared at the figure in the hallway, trying to process what I was seeing. The white shape remained curled up, unmoving. There was something deeply unsettling about it. Not just the way it looked, but the way it appeared so suddenly in a place where nothing had been a moment before. After several seconds, my body finally responded again. The frozen feeling began to fade. I forced myself to turn my head fully toward the doorway so I could see the hallway clearly. And when I did, the figure was gone. The hallway was completely empty. Nothing was there. No white shape, no movement, just the quiet hallway connecting the 2 rooms. I sat there staring for several seconds, trying to understand what had just happened. My heart was still racing. My mind was searching for explanations. Maybe it had been a trick of the light. Maybe something in the room had reflected in a strange way. Maybe my brain had misinterpreted a shadow. But the image I had seen felt incredibly clear in my memory. It didn't feel like a vague shadow or an uncertain shape. It had looked exactly like a small figure sitting on the floor with its arms wrapped around its legs. Eventually, I stood up and walked slowly to the doorway. I looked down the hallway toward the opposite room. Everything looked completely normal. The floor was empty. The other room was quiet. Nothing seemed out of place. I checked both rooms carefully, just to reassure myself that there was no one there. Of course there wasn't. After a while, I returned to my desk and tried to continue studying. But it was difficult to focus. The image of that white figure kept replaying in my mind. What made the experience even stranger was the fact that I had not been watching a horror movie or reading anything frightening beforehand. Sometimes when people see something unusual, it can be explained by their imagination being influenced by scary stories or movies. But that wasn't the case here. I had simply been sitting quietly doing homework. Nothing about the moment had suggested my mind should be imagining something like that. Even stranger is the fact that it never happened again. I lived in that house for quite some time after that night. I used both rooms regularly. I spent many more evenings studying at that same desk. And I never saw anything like that again, not once. The house always continued to feel comfortable and normal. There were no strange noises or repeating experiences. Just that single moment. To this day, I still don't know exactly what I saw. Maybe it really was some strange visual trick caused by lighting or shadows. Maybe my brain misinterpreted something in my peripheral vision and filled in the details. Or maybe it was something else entirely. Whatever the explanation may be, the memory of sitting there frozen in my chair while staring at that white, curled figure in the hallway remains one of the most unsettling moments I have ever experienced in my own home. For most of my life, I have been the kind of person who tries to find a logical explanation for unusual things. Strange noises in a house usually have ordinary causes. Old buildings creak, pipes shift, and shadows can sometimes trick your eyes when you're tired. Because of that mindset, I have always been careful not to jump to conclusions whenever something odd happens around me. Still, there was one night during my early 20s that left me with a memory I have never been able to explain properly. At the time, I was living in a small apartment with a roommate. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple place we had rented because it was close to work and affordable. The building itself wasn't particularly old, and when we moved in, it seemed like a normal, comfortable place to live. For the first year and a half that we stayed there, nothing unusual ever happened. We lived our normal routines. During the week, we worked long hours and came home late. On weekends, we sometimes had friends over or went out in the evenings. The apartment was quiet most of the time, and we never experienced anything that would have made us uneasy. That's why the events of that particular night felt so strange. It started like any other evening. I had gone to bed at a normal hour after a fairly long day. My room was located down a short hallway from my roommate's bedroom. At the end of that same hallway was the apartment's only bathroom. The layout was simple. If you stepped out of my room and looked straight down the hall, you could see my roommate's bedroom door on one side and the bathroom door nearby. Because of that arrangement, I could easily see the entire hallway whenever I opened my bedroom door. That night, I remember drifting off to sleep fairly quickly. My body was tired, and I didn't expect anything unusual to happen. But shortly after I fell asleep, something startled me awake. It felt like someone had suddenly sat down at the end of my bed. The sensation was strong enough that the mattress dipped downward near my feet. The pressure was sudden and noticeable, almost as if someone had placed their full weight there. I woke up immediately. For a split second, my mind was confused. My room was dark and quiet, and I couldn't see anyone there. After a moment, I convinced myself that it had probably been something harmless. Sometimes when people are drifting into sleep, their bodies jerk suddenly. It's a common sensation that happens when your muscles relax too quickly. I figured that maybe I had experienced something like that, and the movement had made the mattress shift under me. That explanation seemed reasonable enough at the time, so after a few minutes I rolled over, adjusted the blanket, and eventually fell back asleep. Several hours passed. The next time I woke up, the digital clock beside my bed read about 3 in the morning. At first I didn't know why I had woken up. Then I heard it. A soft knocking sound at my bedroom door. It wasn't loud or aggressive. It was just a light tapping sound, like someone gently knocking to get my attention. Half asleep, I assumed it was my roommate. Sometimes he stayed up late and might come by my room if he wanted to talk about something or ask a question. Without getting out of bed, I called out toward the door. "What's up? Come in." The hallway outside remained silent. I waited a moment and then said it again. "Hey, come in." Still nothing. At that point, I assumed maybe he had knocked lightly and then walked away before I responded. So I got out of bed and walked toward the door. When I opened it, I had a clear view straight down the hallway. And that's when I saw something. For just a brief moment, I caught sight of a dark figure standing in the hallway. It was difficult to make out details because the lights were off and the hallway was mostly dark. But the shape was clearly there. It looked like the silhouette of a person. The figure was standing near the middle of the hallway. Then, as I watched, it began to move. Slowly and calmly, the figure turned and walked toward the bathroom. The movement was not rushed. It looked almost casual, as if someone had simply gotten up during the night to use the restroom. The figure walked into the bathroom doorway. Then it disappeared inside. But something immediately struck me as strange. No light turned on. Normally, when someone enters a bathroom in the middle of the night, the first thing they do is turn on the light. But the hallway remained completely dark. That small detail made me pause. Still assuming it was my roommate, I stepped out of my room and called down the hallway. "Hey, you all right?" There was no answer. I started walking slowly toward the end of the hallway. As I approached, the first thing I noticed was my roommate's bedroom door. It was slightly open, and from inside I could hear the sound of loud snoring. I stepped closer and looked inside. There he was, fast asleep in his bed. The sound of his breathing made it clear he had been asleep for quite a while. That was the moment when the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, because I had just seen someone walk into the bathroom. But my roommate was still in his bed. I stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself that I had misinterpreted what I saw. Maybe the shadow had been something else. Maybe the darkness had played tricks on my eyes. Still, curiosity and unease pushed me forward. I slowly turned toward the bathroom door. The room inside was completely dark. I took a few cautious steps forward. My heart was beating faster now. Then I reached out and flipped on the light switch. The bathroom lit up instantly, and it was completely empty. No one was inside, no movement, no sign that anyone had been there. But something else hit me immediately. A smell. A strong, overwhelming smell. It filled the air so suddenly that I actually stepped backward in surprise. The odor was sharp and pungent. The only way I could describe it is that it smelled like sulfur. Not just a faint, unpleasant odor, but something incredibly strong and disgusting. The smell was so intense that it made my eyes water and forced me to cover my nose. I had never smelled anything quite like it before. The sensation was so unpleasant that I immediately backed out of the bathroom. My mind was racing at that point. There was no one there, but the smell lingered heavily in the air. I didn't stick around to investigate further. I quickly turned around and walked back down the hallway toward my bedroom. Then I moved even faster, and by the time I reached my room, I practically jumped back into bed and pulled the blanket over myself like a kid trying to hide from something in the dark. For the rest of the night, I lay there wide awake. Every small sound in the apartment made me tense up. I kept replaying the moment in my mind, the knocking at my door, the dark figure walking into the bathroom, my roommate still asleep in his room, and that awful sulfur smell filling the bathroom. Eventually, the sky outside began to lighten. When the first morning sunlight started creeping through the window, I finally felt my body relax a little. But I didn't fall asleep again until much later. Even now, years later, I still think about that night sometimes. Maybe there was a logical explanation for everything. Maybe the shadow I saw was just a trick of the light. Maybe the smell came from a plumbing issue or something strange in the pipes. But the combination of all those things happening together in the middle of the night still leaves me wondering what exactly I experienced in that hallway. When I was about 17 years old, I had a part-time job that often kept me out later than most of my friends. It wasn't anything glamorous, just a typical after-school job that helped me earn some spending money and taught me a little responsibility. Most nights I would get home tired but satisfied after finishing my shift. One particular night I remember very clearly. I had worked a later shift than usual and didn't get home until sometime close to 1 in the morning. By the time I walked through the front door, the entire house was already quiet and dark. My parents had gone to bed hours earlier, and everything inside felt still and peaceful, the way houses often do late at night. I went straight to my room to change out of my work clothes. My dog was already waiting there, curled up on the floor near my bed. He lifted his head when I walked in, wagging his tail lazily, as if to say he was glad I was finally home. After changing into something more comfortable, I suddenly realized how hungry I was. Working late always did that to me. By the time I finished a shift, my stomach would start complaining loudly because I hadn't eaten anything in several hours. The problem was that it was already so late. I didn't want to start cooking anything because I was afraid the noise might wake my parents. Our kitchen was close enough to their bedroom that the sound of pans or the microwave could easily carry through the house. So I decided to sneak into the kitchen quietly and look for something simple to snack on. Our kitchen had an interesting layout. At the far end of the room, there was a door that led directly out into the backyard. The door itself was an older wooden one, but my dad had added an extra layer of security to it. On the outside of the wooden door was a metal security gate. It was one of those sturdy metal doors with a tight grid pattern. The openings were small enough to keep bugs out, but still allowed air to pass through. Because of that, during the warmer months, we would often leave the wooden door open so a breeze could flow through the house while the metal gate remained closed and locked. My dad had always been careful about home security. Along with the metal gate, he had also installed one of those motion sensor security lights outside near the door. You know the kind. Whenever something moves in the yard, the light automatically switches on and floods the area with bright illumination. Usually the only thing that triggered that light at night was when I let my dog outside. But that night, my dog was still in my room. lounging comfortably and waiting for me to come back. I walked quietly into the kitchen, trying not to make any noise. The wooden door was open like usual to allow air inside, but the metal security gate outside remained shut. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I began opening cupboards slowly, searching for something quick and easy to eat. After digging around for a moment, I found a box of Pop-Tarts. It felt like hitting the jackpot. Pop-Tarts were perfect. No cooking required, no noise, and easy to eat quickly. Knowing my dog's habits, I figured I should eat them right there in the kitchen rather than bringing them back to my room. If I walked in holding food, he would almost certainly try to grab it from me before I even had a chance to take a bite. So I opened the package right there on the counter. I didn't bother with the toaster. I just tore the wrapper open and started eating them straight out of the box. I remember standing there in the quiet kitchen, chewing on the first Pop-Tart and enjoying the calm moment after a long day. That's when I heard it, a faint whistling sound. At first it was so quiet that I almost ignored it. The wooden door was open, so I assumed the sound was coming from outside. My first thought was that it was probably the wind. Sometimes wind moving through trees or fences can create strange whistling noises. But after listening for a few seconds, I realized something was different. The whistling wasn't random. It was a tune. Someone was whistling a melody. I didn't recognize the song, but it clearly followed a pattern, like an actual piece of music. The tone of it was strange, too, almost like a mix between something cheerful and something sad at the same time. That description might sound odd, but it's the best way I can explain it. I stood there for a moment, listening. The sound continued. At first, I tried to laugh it off. I thought maybe one of my friends from down the block had noticed that I had just come home from work and decided to mess with me. Maybe they were standing outside the fence, whistling to try and scare me. It wouldn't have been the first time one of my friends tried something like that. But just as I was thinking that, something else happened. The security light outside suddenly switched on. The bright light flooded the backyard immediately. I turned my head and looked outside through the metal security door. The entire yard was clearly visible now. But I didn't see anyone. No movement. No person standing by the fence. Nothing. The whistling continued. At this point, the uneasy feeling in my stomach started growing. If it wasn't one of my friends, then who was out there? And why couldn't I see them? I stood completely still, staring through the metal grid of the security gate into the brightly lit yard. The whistling continued. The tune drifted through the night air, slow and steady. Now my mind was racing. Maybe someone was hiding somewhere just outside the light. Maybe they were crouched near the side of the house or behind something I couldn't see. Or maybe it wasn't anyone I knew at all. The longer I stood there, the more nervous I became. Nearly a full minute passed. The light remained on. The whistling never stopped. Then suddenly something happened that made my heart nearly jump out of my chest. The whistling grew louder. And at that exact moment, the doorknob on the metal security gate began moving, up and down, back and forth. It looked exactly like someone was trying to open the door. I stared straight at it. The security light was still shining brightly across the yard, and I could clearly see the front of the metal gate. There was no one there. No hands. No person standing outside. But the doorknob kept moving. The whistling sounded like it was coming from right outside the door now. The handle rattled again. Up, down. Like someone was trying to get in. That was the moment my brain finally snapped into action. I didn't care about the Pop-Tarts anymore. I dropped the box right there on the counter and ran. I sprinted down the hallway back to my room faster than I had probably moved all day. I slammed the bedroom door shut behind me and locked it. My dog jumped up immediately. sensing the panic in my movements. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept in my room and climbed under my bed, pulling the blankets up around me like some kind of shield. For the rest of the night, I stayed there awake with my dog beside me and the bat in my hands. Every little sound in the house made me tense up. I didn't fall asleep again till the sun started coming up. And after that night, I made one personal rule for myself. No more late-night trips to the kitchen alone. Sorry to pause for just a moment. If this is your first time here, welcome. I hope you're enjoying the calm so far. If you'd like more nights like this, true stories, gentle rain, no interruptions, please subscribe to Lacuna Noir. It really helps me keep creating these peaceful experiences for you. And tap the bell so you're here every time a new story arrives in the dark. Now, back to the story. A few years after my father passed away, something happened that left me with one of the strangest and most emotionally confusing experiences I've ever had. It wasn't frightening in the same way some stories are. Instead, it was unsettling in a quieter, more personal way. The kind that lingers in your thoughts long after the moment has passed. At the time this happened, my father had already been gone for about 3 years. Losing him had been incredibly difficult for my family. And like most people who lose someone close, I carried that absence with me every day. Over time, the sharpness of grief softens a little, but it never completely disappears. Certain memories stay vivid, and sometimes even ordinary moments can unexpectedly remind you of the person you lost. I had slowly settled back into my normal routine by then. Work, friends, odd daily responsibilities. Life continued moving forward the way it always does. Still, every now and then I would catch myself remembering things about my dad, the way he laughed, the tone of his voice, the way he looked when he was concentrating on something. Those memories stayed with me quietly in the background of everyday life. One afternoon, I was riding my motorbike through a nearby town not far from where I lived. Riding had always been something I enjoyed. It gave me a sense of freedom and focus at the same time. When you're on a bike, you're paying attention to everything around you. The traffic, the road conditions, the movement of other vehicles. That particular day, the weather was clear and calm. The roads were busy, but not chaotic, just the typical flow of cars moving through town. Now, I had no reason to think the ride would be anything other than a normal trip home. As I approached one of the busier intersections, traffic began to slow down. Up ahead, there was a bit of a jam, the kind that forms when a few traffic lights in a row start backing cars up into a long line. I gradually eased off the throttle and rolled forward with the rest of the vehicles. Because I was on a motorbike, I had the ability to filter slowly between lanes when traffic was nearly stopped. It's something riders often do in situations like that to move through congestion safely. As I moved carefully between the rows of cars, something caught my attention. In one of the vehicles ahead of me, I saw the side of a man's face. At first, it was just a quick glance, but something about that face looked strangely familiar. You know that feeling when you think you recognize someone but can't immediately place where you know them from? That's what it felt like. Curious. I moved a little closer. The traffic was crawling forward slowly, giving me time to ride alongside the vehicle. From the angle I had, I could only see part of the driver's face through the side window. Still, something about it seemed oddly recognizable. I moved slightly closer to get a better look, and when I finally pulled up beside the car and saw his face clearly, I felt a sudden jolt of disbelief. The man looked exactly like my father, not just similar, not just someone who reminded me of him. He looked identical. For a moment, I honestly thought my mind was playing a trick on me. I stared through the window at the driver, trying to process what I was seeing. The shape of his face, the way his hair was cut, the expression he wore while watching the road ahead. Everything matched my father so closely that it felt surreal. But that couldn't be possible. My father had died 3 years earlier. Yet there I was, sitting on a motorcycle in traffic, looking at a man who appeared to be his exact double. The traffic light changed and the cars began moving again. Without really thinking about it, I stayed near that vehicle as we continued driving through town. Part of me felt like I needed to understand what I was seeing. Maybe it was just someone who resembled him closely. After all, there are millions of people in the world, and sometimes strangers share similar facial features. But the resemblance felt too strong to ignore. Over the next 30 minutes, I found myself following that car through several streets and intersections. I didn't even realize how much time had passed. Each time we stopped at a red light, I would slowly ride up beside the vehicle again and glance through the window. Every time I looked, the same unsettling realization hit me again. The man was the spitting image of my father. As the minutes passed, my thoughts became more and more complicated. At first, it had just been curiosity. But slowly, the experience started stirring deeper emotions. Seeing someone who looked exactly like my dad after so many years triggered memories I hadn't expected to feel that strongly again. I began thinking about the last time I had seen him, about conversations we had shared, about things I wished I could say to him again. And it was like my mind was trying to reconcile the impossible image in front of me with the reality that my father was gone. At one point, the thought even crossed my mind in a strange, almost absurd way. For a brief second, I wondered if somehow I had been mistaken all along. If maybe he hadn't really died. Of course, that thought disappeared as quickly as it came. But the emotional confusion of the moment was powerful. Eventually, I realized that following the car any longer wasn't going to give me any answers. The man had no idea I was there, and there was no reasonable way for me to approach him without creating an awkward or uncomfortable situation. So after about half an hour of riding along nearby, I finally turned off onto a different street and continued home. As I rode away, I kept replaying the experience in my mind. The resemblance had been so strong that it genuinely shook me. Even days later, I found myself thinking about that moment again. The strange feeling of seeing someone who looked exactly like my father sitting in the driver's seat of a random car. What made the story even stranger is that I saw that same vehicle again. Not long after the first encounter, I spotted the same car driving through town one afternoon. It was a very distinctive color and model, so it was easy to recognize, and about a year later, I saw it one more time. Each time I noticed it, the memory of that first encounter came rushing back. I never actually spoke to the driver. I never confirmed whether he really looked as identical to my father as I remembered. But the experience left a lasting impression on me. Sometimes the world produces moments that feel strangely personal, almost like life briefly places something in your path that reminds you of someone you lost. Maybe it was simply a coincidence. Maybe the man just happened to share similar features with my dad. But for those 30 minutes riding through traffic, it felt like the past had somehow appeared beside me on the road. And if that driver ever remembers a motorcyclist who kept pulling up beside his car at every red light, staring in quiet confusion, and following him through town like someone lost in thought, I suppose I owe him an apology. Because for a little while that afternoon, I probably did look like a man completely possessed by a memory. For as long as I can remember, my dog had one very predictable habit that happened almost every single night. Somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning, without fail, he would wake up and want to go outside. It didn't matter what day it was, whether it was a weekday or a weekend, or whether I had stayed up late or gone to bed early. His internal clock seemed to work with incredible accuracy. At first, the routine used to annoy me a little. Waking up in the middle of the night isn't exactly anyone's favorite thing. But after a while, it simply became part of my normal schedule. When you live with a pet long enough, you adapt to their quirks. Every night, when the time came, my dog would nudge me or pace around enough that I would wake up. I'd roll out of bed, walk down the hallway, and let him outside into the backyard. Before doing that, though, I always had to take care of one other small task. We also had a couple of cats in the house, and my dog didn't get along with them very well. To avoid any unnecessary chaos, I would gently guide the cats into their separate room before opening the back door. That way, the dog could go outside without chasing them around the house. It was a simple routine that I had performed hundreds of times before. After letting him outside, I would usually wander into the kitchen for a moment while he did his business in the yard. Sometimes I would grab a glass of water, and sometimes I would make myself a quick late-night snack before heading back to bed. On the night this happened, everything began exactly the same way it always did. Sometime around that familiar early morning hour, my dog woke me up and stood by the door waiting patiently. I got out of bed, put the cats in their room, and opened the back door to let him outside. The air outside was cool and quiet. At that hour of the night, the entire neighborhood usually felt completely still. No cars on the road, no voices, no lights in the surrounding houses, just darkness and silence. I closed the door behind him and wandered through the house for a moment, half awake and half asleep as usual. My dog was extremely well trained. He listened to commands, returned when called, and never wandered far from the yard. Because of that, I never worried about him being outside alone for a few minutes, but a few moments later, I heard something unusual. Barking. Not the casual bark he sometimes gave at squirrels or passing animals. This bark sounded different. It was sharper, louder, and carried a sense of alarm. Immediately, I became concerned. At that hour of the night, the last thing I wanted was for my dog to start barking loudly and wake up everyone else in the house. So I quickly moved toward the back door and stepped outside to call him in. The yard was dark except for a faint glow of moonlight. I looked around for him and quickly spotted where he was standing. He was at the far corner of the yard, near the fence that separated our property from the neighbor's backyard. Normally, when I called his name, he would come running back immediately. But this time, he didn't move. He stood frozen in place, staring intensely at one specific section of the fence. The posture of his body immediately caught my attention. His hair was raised along his back. His tail was stiff and pointed straight upward. Every muscle in his body looked tense. I called his name again and told him to come inside. He didn't respond. That alone was strange enough to make me uneasy. My dog was usually very obedient, and ignoring commands like that was completely out of character for him. I tried again, raising my voice slightly. Still nothing. He remained fixed on that one spot along the fence. His attention was so focused that it was as if he couldn't even hear me. I tried one of the usual tricks I used whenever I wanted to get his attention quickly. I said the words he loved to hear. "It's time to eat." Normally, that phrase would make him spin around instantly and run toward the house. This time, he did wag his tail slightly when he heard it, but his body remained in the same tense posture. His eyes stayed locked on the fence. He still refused to move. That was when I realized something might actually be wrong. I walked across the yard toward him and grabbed his collar. Even as I pulled him away, he kept growling softly toward that section of the fence. It wasn't an aggressive bark anymore. It was a low warning growl, the kind dogs make when they sense something they don't trust. I managed to drag him back toward the house, though he resisted slightly the whole way. Once we reached the door, I opened it and guided him inside. But instead of going back inside immediately myself, I suddenly had an idea. I closed the door behind him and stayed outside. My curiosity had taken over. If something had been on the other side of that fence, I wanted to know what it was. So I stood there quietly in the darkness. I stayed completely still and listened. At first, there was nothing. The night air was silent. 30 seconds passed. Maybe a minute. Then I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint, but unmistakable. Someone was walking on the other side of the fence. I stood there frozen, listening carefully. The footsteps took 2 or 3 slow steps. Then I heard a metallic clanging sound. It sounded like someone bumping into or touching the metal part of the fence. Then everything went silent again. My heart started beating faster. I stayed exactly where I was, trying to hear anything else. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then I heard footsteps again. This time they were moving away from the fence, slowly fading into the distance. Whoever had been there was leaving. I stayed outside for another few moments just to be sure nothing else happened. Then I went back inside and locked the door. At the time, I felt fairly certain about what had happened. My dog had sensed someone near the fence. Most likely someone had been trying to climb over or inspect the yard, possibly looking for something to steal. My dog's barking probably surprised them. And when I came outside to call him, the person may have frozen in place on the other side of the fence, hoping I wouldn't notice them. They probably stayed still until they were sure I had gone back inside. Then they walked away quietly. That explanation made the most sense to me. But later, when I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep again, another thought crossed my mind. I realized how risky my decision had been. Instead of going back inside and locking the door immediately, I had chosen to stand outside alone in the dark. If someone had actually been trying to break into the yard, they could have easily been standing just a few feet away from me on the other side of that fence. Looking back on it now, I realize it was probably one of the dumbest decisions I could have made in that situation. I should have simply gone back inside. But in the moment, curiosity got the better of me. Thankfully, nothing worse happened. And ever since that night, whenever my dog starts barking at something in the yard at 2 or 3 in the morning, I pay very close attention to what he might be trying to tell me. When I was about 7 years old, the neighborhood where I lived still had several empty lots where new houses were slowly being built. It was the kind of suburban area where construction happened in phases. One year there might be only a few houses on a street, and the next year another group of homes would appear where empty land had been before. For kids growing up there, those half-built houses were incredibly tempting places to explore. At that age, curiosity is stronger than caution. When you are 7 years old, an unfinished house doesn't look like a construction site that might be dangerous. Instead, it feels like a giant playground. Rooms without walls, staircases without railings, and basements that echo when you talk all seem like exciting things to discover. And one particular house on our street had been under construction for quite a while. From the outside, it already looked mostly complete. The structure was fully standing, and the roof was finished. But the inside still needed a lot of work. The walls hadn't been finished yet. And there was no drywall, no carpeting, and no proper flooring. It was basically a skeleton of a house waiting for the final steps before someone would move in. For weeks, we had watched construction workers come and go during the daytime. Trucks would park outside while people carried materials in and out. Sometimes we would ride our bikes past the house and try to peek inside through the openings where windows would eventually be installed. Then one evening, everything changed. It was nighttime, and the construction site was completely empty. No trucks, no workers, and no equipment. Just a silent house sitting in the dark. A group of neighborhood kids had gathered outside earlier that evening to play. Someone eventually brought up the idea of going inside the unfinished house. At first, it was just a suggestion. But once the idea was spoken out loud, everyone became interested. To a group of kids, the chance to explore a place that adults hadn't finished yet felt like a secret adventure. The fact that it was nighttime only made the idea more exciting. There were probably 6 or 7 of us in the group that night. Some of the older kids had flashlights, which made the plan feel even more official. With those beams of light cutting through the darkness, it felt like we were explorers entering some unknown place. The house was easy to enter because the windows hadn't been installed yet. Large empty frames were left where the glass would eventually go. We climbed through one of those openings and stepped into the house. Immediately, the atmosphere inside felt strange compared to the quiet street outside. The structure echoed slightly when we walked across the unfinished floors. Every footstep sounded louder than usual, because there was nothing inside the house yet to absorb the sound. We started exploring the main floor first. Even though it was dark outside, the open window frames allowed a small amount of moonlight to spill into the rooms. Combined with the flashlights we carried, it was enough to see our surroundings. The house looked enormous from the inside. Without furniture or finished walls, the rooms felt bigger than they actually were. Wooden beams and construction materials were scattered around the floor, and exposed studs showed where the walls would eventually be finished. We walked from room to room, shining our flashlights around and talking quietly to each other. Every now and then, someone would tap on a beam or stomp on the floor just to hear the sound echo through the empty house. After exploring the main floor for a while, someone suggested we go upstairs. The staircase had already been installed, though it didn't yet have a finished railing. One by one, we climbed up, our flashlights bouncing light across the unfinished walls as we went. The second floor looked much like the first. Rooms without doors, bare wooden frames, the faint smell of fresh lumber hanging in the air. We wandered through the upstairs hallway, peeking into each unfinished bedroom and imagining what the house might look like once someone actually moved in. Eventually, one of the older kids had another idea. Let's check out the basement. Basements always seemed mysterious when we were younger. They were darker, quieter, and usually a little colder than the rest of a building. Someone found the staircase that led down to the basement. We turned our flashlights toward the steps and began walking down one by one. The air felt cooler as we descended. The basement was darker than the rest of the house because there were fewer openings for light. The only illumination came from the flashlights we carried. When we reached the bottom, we began walking slowly across the concrete floor. The sound of our footsteps echoed loudly in the open space. Our flashlights scanned across the walls and beams, lighting up random construction materials stacked in corners. For a few moments, everything felt normal. Then something happened that none of us expected. Somewhere in the basement, a voice suddenly roared out. It was incredibly loud and unbelievably deep. "Get out, now!" The sound echoed off the unfinished walls, making it seem even more powerful. The voice was so sudden and so intense that every one of us froze in place. My heart immediately started pounding in my chest. For a second, nobody moved or said anything. Then one of the kids in our group nervously called out into the darkness. "Who's there?" The basement went silent for a moment. Then the voice answered. "The devil." The word echoed through the basement in a way that made it sound even more terrifying. At 7 years old, hearing something like that in a dark basement was enough to trigger pure panic. No one stopped to question what the voice might actually be. No one stayed to investigate. Every single one of us turned and ran. Flashlights bounced wildly as we rushed up the stairs as fast as we could. Some of the kids nearly tripped over each other trying to get out of the basement first. We sprinted through the house, climbed back out through the open window frame, and ran all the way down the street without looking back. None of us slowed down until we were several houses away from the construction site. When we finally stopped running, everyone began talking at once. Some kids insisted they had heard the voice clearly. Others claimed they had seen something move in the basement before the voice shouted. At that age, our imaginations were already running wild. Looking back now as an adult, I can almost certainly guess what really happened. Most likely, someone had been staying in that unfinished house temporarily. Perhaps a homeless person or someone looking for shelter had taken refuge in the basement while the construction site was empty at night. When a group of noisy kids suddenly walked in with flashlights, they probably shouted at us in the deepest voice they could manage just to scare us away. And it worked perfectly. Because from that night forward, none of us ever went back into that house again. The construction eventually finished, and a family moved in not long after. To them, it probably looked like a perfectly normal home. But to those of us who had heard that booming voice in the dark basement, it always remained the place where something once shouted that it was the devil and told us to get out. When I was 16 years old, there was one night that still stands out in my memory as one of the strangest and most unsettling experiences I had growing up. Nothing truly dangerous ended up happening, but the series of small events that unfolded that evening left both my sister and me feeling shaken for a long time afterward. At the time, I was living at home with my family in a fairly ordinary suburban house. It was the kind of place where most days felt predictable and safe. We had lived there long enough that every corner of the house was familiar to us. There were no strange noises we weren't used to, no creepy basements or old attics, just a regular family home where life moved along normally. On the night this happened, my older sister and I were the only ones home. Our parents had gone out for the evening, and another one of our sisters had also gone somewhere else. That left just the two of us hanging out together in the house. We had settled in the lounge room to watch television. It was a typical quiet night. Nothing unusual, nothing exciting. The television was playing in the background, and we were both half watching and half talking about random things. Our dogs were nearby as well. They had a habit of lying near the doorway that led toward the back part of the house, where the back door and kitchen were located. From where we were sitting, we could easily see them in that doorway area. Everything felt calm. Then suddenly, the dogs started barking. Not just a casual bark or two, but the kind of intense barking that happens when they think someone is approaching the house. Their bodies stiffen, and they focus their attention toward the back door. Both my sister and I immediately noticed. We turned our heads toward them, watching as they barked aggressively toward the hallway. At first, we assumed someone had arrived home. Sometimes family members came back unexpectedly, and the dogs always reacted the same way when they heard someone outside the door. A few seconds later, we heard a sound that confirmed what we thought. The back door opened. Then it slammed shut. The noise echoed through the house clearly enough that we both looked at each other. Right after the door slammed, I saw something move across the doorway near the dogs. a shadow. It crossed the doorway quickly, just enough for us to notice it out of the corner of our eyes. The dogs reacted immediately. Instead of running toward the hallway the way they normally would when greeting someone they knew, they did the exact opposite. They ran straight toward us. Both dogs squeezed themselves under our legs and continued barking toward the doorway behind them. That reaction made the situation feel a little strange. Normally, when someone from the family walked in, the dogs would run up to greet them happily. But this time, they seemed frightened. Still, we tried to explain it away. We called out toward the hallway. "Hello?" No one answered. We tried again. Still nothing. After a moment, we shrugged it off and assumed it must have been our other sister coming home in a bad mood. Sometimes she walked through the house without saying anything right away, especially if she was tired or irritated about something. So we went back to watching television. A few minutes passed. Eventually, a commercial break came on. During that break, I decided to run upstairs quickly to grab something from my room. I walked up the stairs without thinking much about what had happened earlier. The house felt quiet again, and I assumed our sister had gone into one of the rooms upstairs. But as I reached the top of the stairs, I heard something. It was coming from my mom's office. The door to that room was slightly closed, and I could hear faint noise inside. It sounded like someone talking. At first, I thought maybe my mom had come home unexpectedly and was in her office listening to something. As I walked toward the room, I started speaking casually, assuming she was inside. "Hey, Mom," I continued talking as I approached the door. But when I opened it, the room was empty. There was no one there. The only thing making noise in the room was the radio. It had been turned on and was playing quietly. I stood there for a moment, confused. The radio had definitely sounded like someone talking from outside the room. But I knew my mom wasn't home yet. I stepped inside and turned the radio off. Now the room was completely silent. At that moment, I started feeling uneasy. If my mom wasn't home, then who had turned the radio on? Trying to stay calm, I decided to check my sister's bedroom. If she had come home earlier and gone upstairs, maybe she had been the one who turned it on. I walked down the hallway and pushed her door open. The room was empty. That's when a sudden realization hit me. There was no one else in the house. The back door had opened. We'd seen a shadow cross the doorway. The dogs had reacted like they were scared. And the radio in my mom's office had somehow been turned on. A rush of fear hit me all at once. I didn't waste another second upstairs. I sprinted down the stairs as fast as I could. When I reached the lounge, I grabbed a kitchen knife from the nearby counter and explained to my sister what I had just discovered. No one else is home. The moment those words came out of my mouth, the atmosphere in the room changed completely. We both realized the same thing at the same time. If no one from our family had come home, then someone else might be inside the house. Almost immediately after that realization, the lights flickered, just once or twice. But that was enough to make our nerves even worse. My sister quickly grabbed a couple of candles in case the power went out. Meanwhile, I picked up the phone and called our neighbor. I explained what was happening and asked them to stay alert in case something strange was going on. Then I called our parents and told them to come home as soon as possible. After that, my sister and I did the only thing we could think of. We sat together in the corner of the lounge room with the dogs, waiting. Neither of us felt brave enough to go wandering around the house to investigate further. We just stayed there, listening for any sound. Minutes felt like hours. Every creak of the house made us tense up. Eventually, our parents arrived home. They checked the house carefully, room by room. But no one was there. Nothing appeared disturbed. No windows were broken. No doors were unlocked. Everything looked exactly the way it should have. The only strange detail that remained unexplained was the radio in my mom's office. When we told her about it, she said something that made the situation even creepier. She hadn't turned it on. To this day, I still think about that night sometimes. Maybe someone had entered the house and left before we realized what was happening. Maybe the back door had somehow swung open on its own, and we misunderstood what we saw. Or maybe something else entirely had happened. But the thought that someone might have been hiding in that office while I was walking toward the door still sends chills down my spine. Because if they had been standing there, instead of that radio playing quietly in the room, the situation could have turned out very differently. There was a time in my life when I was living alone in a small apartment. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple place that worked for what I needed at the time. It had a small kitchen, a modest living room, a bedroom, and a bathroom tucked into one side of the unit. The building itself wasn't very large either. It was the kind of quiet apartment complex where people mostly kept to themselves. You might pass a neighbor in the hallway once in a while, but most days you barely saw anyone. Living alone was something I had gotten used to fairly quickly. At first, it felt a little strange not having anyone else in the space with me, but over time, it became comfortable. I developed small routines that made the apartment feel like my own private little world. I knew exactly where everything was, and I was usually very aware of the condition of the place whenever I left or came back. That's why what happened one evening stood out so clearly. I had gone out during the day for work and a few errands. It was nothing unusual. I left the apartment in the morning the same way I always did. I locked the door behind me and headed out to start the day. I didn't think twice about it. Later that evening, when I returned home, something felt slightly off the moment I stepped inside. It's hard to explain exactly what that feeling was. The apartment looked normal. Nothing obvious seemed different at first glance. But there was this strange sense that the atmosphere inside the space had changed somehow. Most people who have lived alone for a while probably understand what I mean. You get used to the way your home feels when you walk in the door, the quiet, the arrangement of things, even the smell of the place. That evening, it felt just a little different. Still, I told myself I was probably imagining things. I walked through the apartment like I always did when I came home. I dropped my keys in the usual place, set my bag down, and started settling into the evening. For a while, I didn't notice anything unusual. But later that night, while I was in the kitchen throwing something away, I opened the trash can and noticed something strange. Inside the garbage were the used remains of what looked like a cake decorating kit. There were bits of plastic packaging, small tubes that looked like icing tools, and other pieces that clearly came from one of those kits people use to decorate cakes at home. I stared at the trash for a moment, confused. I hadn't bought a cake decorating kit. I hadn't made a cake. And I definitely hadn't thrown anything like that away. At first, I wondered if maybe it had somehow been left in the trash from earlier, and I simply hadn't noticed it before. But the more I thought about it, the less sense that explanation made. I was pretty good about keeping the apartment tidy, and I usually remembered exactly what I had thrown away. The cake decorating items definitely didn't belong there. I tried to shrug it off, thinking maybe I had forgotten about throwing something away earlier in the week. But then I noticed something else. In the corner of the living room, I kept a fern plant. It wasn't anything special, just a small decorative plant that I liked having around because it made the room feel a little more alive. As I looked at it that night, something about it seemed different. The plant looked smaller. When I stepped closer, I realized why. Several of the fern's leaves had been trimmed. The cut pieces were gone from the plant itself. But when I checked the trash again, I saw them there. The trimmed leaves had been tossed into the garbage along with the cake decorating items. That's when the uneasy feeling really started to grow. I hadn't trimmed the plant. I rarely even touched it, except to water it. Yet someone had clearly cut pieces off and thrown them away. I stood there in the kitchen for a long moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The first logical question that came to mind was obvious. Had someone been inside my apartment while I was gone? That idea immediately made me uncomfortable. As far as I knew, no one else had a key to my place. The landlord certainly had one for maintenance emergencies, but I had never been told about anyone entering the apartment while I was away. And if maintenance had come in for some reason, why would they leave behind something like a cake decorating kit in my trash? It didn't make any sense. I walked slowly through the rest of the apartment, looking around carefully. Nothing else appeared disturbed. Furniture was exactly where it should be. Nothing was missing. Doors and windows were closed and locked the way I had left them. Yet those two things remained impossible to ignore. Someone had apparently thrown away a cake decorating kit in my kitchen trash, and someone had trimmed my fern plant. For the rest of that evening, I felt uneasy. The apartment suddenly didn't feel quite as safe or predictable as it had before. I kept thinking about all the possibilities. Maybe someone from the building had somehow entered by mistake. Maybe the landlord had let a worker in without telling me. Maybe I had simply forgotten doing those things myself. But none of those explanations really fit. What made the situation even stranger was the cake decorating kit. If someone had used it, where was the cake? There were no crumbs, no plates, no evidence that anything had actually been baked or eaten. Just the empty decorating tools sitting in the trash. The more I thought about it, the more confusing it became. In the days that followed, the feeling lingered. Every time I came home from work, I paused at the door before stepping inside. I would unlock it slowly and listen for any sounds. Once inside, I started doing something I had never done before. I checked every room. Closets, corners, behind doors. I would walk through the apartment carefully just to make sure no one else was there. It might sound a little paranoid, but living alone suddenly felt different after that night. The thought that someone could have been inside my apartment without me knowing about it was unsettling. For weeks afterward, that cautious routine continued. Every time I came home, I scanned the rooms and made sure everything looked exactly the way I had left it. Nothing like that ever happened again. No strange items appeared in the trash. The fern plant was never trimmed again. And as time passed, life slowly returned to normal. Still, that one strange evening remained a mystery. I never received an explanation. No surprise party appeared. No neighbor admitted to accidentally entering the wrong apartment. Oh, no maintenance worker claimed responsibility. Even now, when I think back on it, I still can't figure out what actually happened that day. All I know is that someone, or something, apparently decorated a cake that never existed and decided my fern needed a haircut. And for weeks afterward, every time I stepped through that apartment door, I made absolutely sure I was alone. A few years ago, something happened in my family that has always stayed with me. It wasn't one of those dramatic moments where everything is immediately explained or where people clearly understand what they witnessed. Instead, it was the kind of experience that leaves more questions than answers. Even now, whenever the story comes up, the people involved still talk about it with a mix of curiosity and unease. The story really begins with my grandmother. She had always been a strong and independent woman. Even as she grew older, she refused to slow down the way many people her age eventually do. She lived in her own home and insisted on doing most things by herself. She cooked her own meals, kept the house clean, and rarely asked anyone for help unless it was absolutely necessary. Anyone who knew her would describe her as stubborn in the best possible way. She liked having control over her daily life and never wanted to feel like she was a burden to anyone else. Because of that independence, my family never worried too much about her living alone. She was careful and capable, and we visited often enough to check in on her. But one night, everything changed. It happened late in the evening. My grandmother was in her house going about her usual routine. At some point, she went into the bathroom, and while she was there, she slipped and fell. The fall was severe enough that she broke her back. It was a terrible accident and a painful experience for her. Eventually, she was found and taken to the hospital, where doctors treated the injury and began the long process of helping her recover. Naturally, the entire family was shocked and worried when we heard the news. Accidents like that are always frightening, especially when they happen to someone older who lives alone. In the days and weeks that followed, everyone focused on helping her heal and making sure she had the support she needed. But then, a few weeks later, another strange piece of the story surfaced. It came from my dad. My dad had always been someone who occasionally talked about unusual experiences. He wasn't the kind of person who constantly told ghost stories or tried to convince people of strange things. But he had mentioned over the years that he had sometimes experienced moments he couldn't easily explain. For example, there had been a few times when he described sensing things that seemed out of place or noticing odd occurrences that other people might have ignored. Most of the time, he didn't talk about those moments very much. They were simply things he had experienced and moved on from. But after my grandmother's accident, he remembered something unusual that had happened on the exact same night. He hadn't thought much about it at first. In fact, he hadn't even mentioned it to anyone until he realized that the timing lined up perfectly with the moment my grandmother fell. According to him, that night had started normally. He had gone to bed at the usual time and fallen asleep without any problems. Sometime later, in the middle of the night, something suddenly woke him up. He described it as a sharp jolt, the kind that pulls you out of sleep instantly, almost like your body reacts before your mind fully understands what is happening. When he opened his eyes, he immediately noticed something strange. His bedroom was filled with lights, not just one or two small lights, thousands of them. He said they looked like tiny flashes scattered throughout the entire room. The lights seemed to flicker and sparkle everywhere he looked, almost like countless small fireflies filling the air. At first, he thought he might still be dreaming. That's usually the first explanation when something unusual happens during the night. Our minds sometimes produce vivid images as we transition between sleep and wakefulness. But he insisted that he was fully awake. He sat up in bed and looked around the room carefully. The lights were still there. They weren't coming from outside the window. They weren't reflections from cars or street lamps. The entire room itself seemed to contain these tiny, flashing points of light. He said the sight was so overwhelming that it almost felt like the air itself was glowing. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night and seeing your entire bedroom filled with thousands of tiny sparks. That's how he described it. The lights weren't forming shapes or patterns. They were simply everywhere, flickering and glowing all around him. For a few moments, he just sat there in silence, trying to understand what he was seeing. Eventually, the lights faded. The room slowly returned to darkness, and everything looked normal again. He never mentioned it to anyone at the time. Like many people, he assumed it might have been some strange visual effect caused by waking up suddenly. Sometimes when you open your eyes quickly after sleeping, your vision can play tricks on you for a few seconds. So he simply went back to sleep and forgot about it. Weeks passed before the connection became clear. When the family started talking about the timeline of my grandmother's accident, they realized something interesting. The time when she had fallen in the bathroom matched the exact moment when my dad had woken up and seen the lights. When he realized that, he became convinced that the two events were somehow related. He believed that the lights might have been a warning. In his mind, it felt like something or someone had tried to wake him up at that moment, perhaps to alert him that something bad had happened to his mother. Of course, there was no way to prove that explanation. There could easily be logical reasons for what he saw. The human brain is capable of producing strange visual effects, especially when we wake up suddenly in the middle of the night. But the coincidence in timing made the experience difficult for him to ignore. When he eventually told me about it, he said something else that stuck with me. He asked me not to tell my mom. He wasn't worried about being embarrassed or misunderstood. Instead, he said he didn't want to scare her. In his words, if she believed that something strange had filled their bedroom that night, she might never feel comfortable sleeping in that room again. So he kept the story quiet. Even now, whenever I think about that night, I'm not sure what to believe. Maybe it was simply a coincidence. Maybe the lights were a trick of the eyes or a brief dream that blended into waking life. Or maybe there really are moments when something beyond our understanding reaches out in ways we can't easily explain. All I know is that on the same night my grandmother suffered a terrible fall, my dad woke up to a room filled with thousands of mysterious lights. And for him, that memory has always felt like more than just a coincidence. For as long as I can remember, closets have always made me uneasy. Even now as an adult, I sometimes catch myself glancing at them a little longer than necessary before going to sleep. Most people have small childhood fears that fade away over time. Fear of the dark, fear of monsters under the bed, or fear of strange noises in the house at night. For me, the thing that always bothered me most was the closet. The strange part is that this fear didn't just come from imagination. It was tied to something that happened when I was younger. Something that I still remember very clearly, even though many years have passed. When I was around 5 years old, I started having a very specific nightmare. It wasn't one of those random dreams that changes every night. It was the exact same dream over and over again. My bedroom back then had a long, narrow closet. It wasn't very wide, maybe about 3 feet across, but it stretched deep into the wall, almost 20 feet long. It was the kind of closet where you could store a lot of things, and because of its shape, it always seemed darker than the rest of the room. Every night in my dream, I would wake up in my bed and stare at the closet door. At first, nothing would happen. Then slowly, very slowly, the closet door would begin to open. The movement was always quiet and deliberate. The door would creak just slightly as it swung outward. Inside the darkness of the closet, something was standing there. I could never see its face clearly, but I could tell that it was watching me. The figure would remain completely still for a moment, as if it were studying me from across the room. Then, suddenly, the closet door would slam shut. That was always the moment when I would wake up in a panic. For years, from about the age of 5 until I was around 8, that dream happened almost every night. Sometimes there were small differences in the details, but the core of the dream was always the same. The closet door opening, the shadow inside, and the feeling of being watched. At that age, I never told anyone about it in detail. Kids often assume that nightmares are just something they have to deal with on their own. Still, the dream affected me enough that I would often hesitate before going to bed. I remember staring at the closet door for long periods of time before finally falling asleep. Eventually, as I got older, the dreams started happening less often. By the time I was around 9 or 10 years old, they had mostly stopped. Around that same time, I joined a karate class. My parents thought it would be a good activity for me. It helped me build confidence, discipline, and physical strength. I enjoyed the classes and quickly got used to the routine of going to practice a few evenings each week. One afternoon after karate practice, I came home feeling tired but relaxed. It had been a normal day. Nothing unusual had happened, and I wasn't thinking about those old nightmares anymore. When we got home, I went upstairs to my bedroom to change clothes. As I reached the top of the stairs and walked toward my room, everything seemed perfectly normal. But the moment I opened my bedroom door, something felt strange. The room was dark. That immediately confused me because it was still daytime outside. The sun was shining brightly, and normally my bedroom would be full of natural light at that hour. Instead, the inside of the room looked dim, almost shadowy. I stood there in the doorway for a moment trying to understand why the room looked so dark. At first, I thought maybe the curtains had been closed. But when I looked more carefully, I realized that wasn't the case. The light from the window should have been filling the room, yet somehow the space still felt darker than it should have been. As I stood there in the doorway, still trying to figure it out, I heard a sound. It was coming from the closet. At first, it was very soft, a faint rattling noise. I turned my head slowly toward the closet door. The doorknob was moving, very gently at first, almost like someone inside was testing it. The metal knob began to twist slightly back and forth. I froze. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. All I could do was watch. The doorknob continued to turn slowly, and then the door itself began to open. The hinges creaked quietly as the door moved outward. My heart started pounding. The movement was so similar to the way the closet door opened in my old nightmares that for a moment I felt like I was still dreaming. The door continued to open inch by inch. Then I saw something. A hand. It reached around the edge of the door from the inside. The hand looked dark and shadowy against the dim light of the room. It gripped the edge of the door as it opened wider. I couldn't move. I just stood there watching. The closet door kept opening until it was completely wide. And then I saw the figure standing inside. It was tall, very tall compared to the size of the closet. The figure appeared to be wearing dark robes that hung loosely around its body. The fabric looked almost black, and it seemed to absorb the light around it. A hood covered its head, hiding its face in darkness. I couldn't see any facial features. Just the shape of a tall figure standing silently inside the closet. The sight of it was exactly like the thing I'd seen in my nightmares for years. The same dark shape, the same sense of being watched, the same position inside the closet. At that moment, my body finally reacted. I turned and ran. I sprinted down the stairs as fast as I could, my heart racing in my chest. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I immediately started telling my parents what had just happened. They could see how shaken I was. Even though the story sounded strange, they followed me upstairs to check the room. When we reached the top of the stairs and walked back toward my bedroom, everything looked normal again. The door to my room was open. Sunlight filled the space just the way it should have. And the closet door was closed. My parents walked into the room and looked around carefully. They opened the closet. There was nothing inside except the usual clothes and boxes that had always been there. No tall figure, no dark robes, no shadowy hand. Everything looked completely normal. To them, it seemed like nothing unusual had happened at all. But I knew what I had seen. The experience stayed with me for a long time after that. The strange thing is that nothing like it ever happened again. The closet never rattled. The door never opened by itself. And the nightmares about the figure stopped completely after that day. Even now, years later, I still think about that moment sometimes. I don't know if my mind somehow turned my old nightmares into something that felt real for a few seconds, or if there was some other explanation entirely. All I know is that for one brief moment, the thing that had haunted my dreams for years seemed to step out of the closet and into the real world. When I was a child, I experienced something one night that stayed with me for years afterward. Even now, long after it happened, I can still remember the feeling of fear that came with it. Looking back as an adult, I understand that I was probably extremely sick at the time, running a high fever from the flu. Fever can do strange things to the mind, especially in children. It can cause confusion, hallucinations, and distorted perceptions of reality. Still, even knowing that now, I struggle to remember another moment in my life when I felt such raw, overwhelming terror. The night began like many others during that period when I was sick. I had been in bed for most of the day, feeling weak and exhausted. My body ached, my head felt heavy, and my temperature had been running high. My parents had been checking on me frequently, bringing medicine and water, trying to keep me comfortable while the illness ran its course. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep in my bedroom. My room was fairly simple. The layout was something I knew extremely well because I had lived there for years. It was basically a rectangle in shape, with my bed positioned against one wall and a few familiar pieces of furniture arranged around the room. Near the entrance, there was a small corridor-like space that led to the door. It wasn't a long hallway, just a narrow section of the room about 6 feet long that connected the main part of the bedroom to the doorway. Under normal circumstances, the room felt completely ordinary and safe. But that night was different. At some point during the night, I woke up suddenly. The first thing I noticed was that something felt wrong. My body was burning with fever, and my mind felt foggy and confused. When I opened my eyes, the room around me didn't look the way it normally did. At first, I thought I was still dreaming. The shapes of the walls and furniture seemed to shift slightly as I stared at them. The corners of the room looked like they were bending and twisting in the slow motion. The walls appeared to move inward and outward as if the entire room were breathing. I remember blinking several times, trying to clear my vision. But the strange movement continued. The objects in the room seemed to drift in and out of focus. One moment they looked normal, and the next moment they seemed distorted or stretched in unnatural ways. Then I looked toward the small corridor that led to the door. That was when the experience became even more disturbing. Instead of looking like the short 6-foot passage that I knew it was, the corridor appeared to stretch away from me endlessly. It looked like it had grown into a long tunnel extending far into the distance. The door at the end was barely visible, like a tiny shape sitting at the far end of an impossibly long hallway. I remember staring at it in disbelief. Part of my mind knew that what I was seeing didn't make sense, but another part of my mind was completely convinced that the room had somehow changed shape. My heart began to pound faster. The fever made everything feel unreal, like I was trapped inside a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. Eventually, the fear pushed me to get out of bed. I stumbled to my feet and began walking toward the door. The floor felt unsteady beneath me, and the hallway still looked stretched and distorted as I approached it. Every step felt strange, like I was walking through a dream rather than a real room. When I reached the door, I opened it and stepped into the hallway outside my bedroom. My mother must have heard the movement because she was already there. She had probably heard me getting out of bed and came to check on me. Seeing her standing there should have made me feel relieved. But instead, things became even more confusing. She began speaking to me. I could see her mouth moving clearly as she talked, but I couldn't hear a single sound. It was as if someone had suddenly turned off all the audio in the world. Her lips moved, forming words that I could see but not hear. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining that too. I tried to focus harder, straining to hear what she was saying. But there was nothing. Complete silence. The moment terrified me. I tried to speak to her. I remember trying to explain that I couldn't hear anything, that something was wrong, that the room had been moving, and that I felt incredibly sick. But even as I spoke, everything felt disconnected. She kept talking, her lips moving rapidly, as if she was asking questions or trying to calm me down. But no sound reached my ears. It was like watching a silent movie. Then something happened that made the moment even more disturbing. After a few seconds, my mother turned around and began walking away down the hallway. But the way she moved looked completely wrong. The motion of her walking seemed slightly sped up, almost like someone had pressed fast forward on a video recording. Her movements were smooth but unnaturally quick, the way ghosts or strange figures sometimes move in movies. It didn't look like the normal way a person walks. Seeing that sent another wave of fear through me. My mind was struggling to process everything at once. The twisting room, the silent voices, the strange, unnatural movement. At that point, I felt completely overwhelmed. Instead of following her, I slowly turned around and walked back into my bedroom. My heart was racing, and my entire body felt weak and shaky. I climbed back into bed and pulled the covers tightly around myself. Wrapping myself in the blankets felt like the only thing I could do to protect myself from whatever was happening. I lay there curled up under the covers, trying to calm my breathing, and hoping the strange sensations would pass. Eventually, I must have fallen back asleep. The next morning, things were very different. The room looked normal again. The walls were straight. The corridor leading to the door was the normal short distance it had always been. The furniture was exactly where it should be. When my parents asked me about the night before, they told me something that surprised me. Apparently, when I'd stumbled into the hallway, I hadn't been speaking clearly at all. They said I was mumbling and gibbering in a way that didn't make sense, like someone talking in their sleep. I wasn't responding properly to questions, and I seemed confused and disoriented. In other words, from their perspective, I was simply a very sick child wandering the hallway while delirious with a fever. But from my perspective, the experience had been something far more intense. The fear I felt during those moments was incredibly real. Even now, years later, I can still remember the sensation of the room twisting around me and the hallway stretching endlessly toward the door. I can still picture my mother standing there with her lips moving silently, while I struggled to understand what was happening. And I can still recall the strange, unnatural way she walked away down the hall. Logically, I know the fever likely caused hallucinations and distorted perceptions of sound and movement. But the emotional impact of that night stayed with me for a very long time. It remains one of the most terrifying experiences I have ever had as a child, even if the explanation behind it was simply the strange and powerful effects of a high fever. Look, if you're still watching, you already know what this channel is. No jump scares, no fake drama, just real stories about real people who survive things most of us can't even imagine. And that's scarier than any movie could ever be. If you want more of this raw, unfiltered truth, told the way it deserves to be told, subscribe to Lacuna Noir. We're not here to waste your time. We're here to tell the stories that actually matter. Thanks for listening. Now go get some sleep, if you can.